Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Kayla Edwards from the Pulitzer Center. Thank you for joining us today for The Zip Code Can Change Everything, COVID's Toll on a St. Louis Neighborhood. As we wait for more people to join us, please let us know in the chat where you're listening from. For those who have not joined us before, welcome. The Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization with the mission to elevate public engagement with underreported issues. While we're based in Washington, D.C., our work and our staff are global. We support more than 170 reporting projects each year in collaboration with news outlets around the world, bringing together this work by themes on our website, including racial justice, migration, public health, and more. And we don't stop with just the reporting. Our education programming spans from elementary schools to graduate degree programs and outreach to the broader public. Over the last year, the Pulitzer Center has supported several reporting projects that follow how local communities across the United States have managed the COVID-19 pandemic. During our time today, we'll dive into the Pulitzer Center-supported project 63106, the struggle to survive the pandemic in St. Louis's most vulnerable neighborhoods. Today's panelists will share insights on how this reporting project was imagined, the work journalists have done to capture stories across the 63106 zip code, and how the families featured in the project have been impacted by the work. A few logistics as we begin. Our aim is to incorporate audience questions as part of today's conversations. You'll see an Q&A icon on your screen. Please begin adding questions as soon as something comes to mind during the conversation. There's also a chat icon on your screen. We'd appreciate it if you'd use the chat box only for technology-specific issues. Note that all attendees are muted, but if you can't hear any of us, please let us know via the chat box. We also want to let you know we are recording this session to post online at a later date. And one final note, please remember to stay online once the conversation ends to participate in a brief survey. We'd love to know how we can improve our programming. Now, I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers for today. Richard Weiss is an award-winning journalist who spent decades working and reporting at the St. Louis Dispatch and other outlets. He's also the executive editor at the Before Ferguson, Beyond Ferguson Storytelling Project. Leyla Fern King is a storyteller at the Before Ferguson, Beyond Ferguson Project. Her writing has appeared in the St. Louis Jewish Light and the St. Louis American. And finally, Misha Marshall is a resident of the 63106 zip code in St. Louis. Her family was profiled as part of the project, and she works in healthcare as a medical assistant. Thank you all for joining me here today. And I want to get started with some just background information about the project for our audience. So I'm going to turn to Dick Weiss. Can you tell us what the 63106 project is?
Well, thank you, Kayla, and thanks for having us. Our group of storytellers with support from the Pulitzer Center have written stories over the last 3 years advancing the cause of racial equity. Along with shining a light on underserved residents, we serve mainstream media in St. Louis by providing rich, in-depth stories at no charge at a time when their staffs were facing layoffs and furloughs. And thanks to the Pulitzer Center and other generous donors, we were able to pay our writers $1 a word for their work and other contributors kind of a commensurate rate.
Thanks, Dick. And then can you tell us what inspired you and the journalists involved to pursue this project itself?
Well, in a couple of words, Kayla, the pandemic. Where before we were doing long form stories and rolling them out approximately quarterly, the pandemic brought a sense of urgency and a focus. Our team set its sights on neighborhoods within the 63106 zip code. So you might ask, why 63106? Well, a landmark study prepared by researchers at Washington University's Brown School of Social Work revealed that across our entire region, 63106 had the most problematic social determinants of health. Now, I'll just give you one revealing data point. A child born in 63106 in 2010 would have a life expectancy of 67 years old. And you can contrast that to 63105, which is Clayton in our region, wealthy, mostly white, and there a child could expect to live to 85. And this was before the pandemic.
And finally, Dick, so you know that the Pulitzer Center, we focus on underreported issues or things that might not be or make it to the headlines. So I'm curious, what was missing in previous reporting about this neighborhood or the zip code that you all were able to share?
Yeah, Kayla, that's a great question. What the niche I think that we wanted to explore was that we didn't want to do stories that were one and done, as the media so often does. Sometimes they're called drive-bys. We've been following 8 families throughout the pandemic and sharing them with mainstream media for the last 14 months. One family for each media outlet. We had a story surfacing approximately once a month with one of our media partners. For those who want to do a deeper dive, the stories that we've done are curated at our website, before Ferguson, beyondferguson.org, and on the Pulitzer Center's website as well. So Misha is more than a subject of our story. She's been our partner in demonstrating the difficulty that families have faced over generations in gaining their purchase on the American dream. Misha is 38, I think I got that right, and her family in many ways is among the most vulnerable people in an exceedingly vulnerable neighborhood. Her parents, John and Kathy, 76 and 74 years old, are both dealing with health issues that have more or less kept them confined to the home they share with Misha, her 2 children, and Misha's sister, Maya, who has a congenital brain disorder. Misha is Maya's primary caretaker, as well as primary breadwinner for her family. So that's just a little bit. I'm going to let Misha and Leyla Fern take it from here. But before bowing out, I just wanted to mention something you may have already noticed. Leyla Fern is a young adult. Part of our mission at Before Ferguson, Beyond Ferguson is to train up young storytellers. The story she wrote for us represents her professional debut. In other words, getting paid for her work. But she's been writing about social justice issues for several years, which she can tell you about. So back to you, Kayla.
Thanks, Dick. And Leyla and Misha, I'm very excited to speak with both of you today and kind of hear about your experiences working on the project. So I want to get started with Leyla and learn, how did you get involved in the 63106 project?
Yeah, so there's sort of 2 parts to this story. So anyone who has my father on Facebook knows that he posts about 2 things, me and my pet rat. And so my father has posted a lot of my work of writing, visual art on his Facebook, and anyone who has him on Facebook feels like they know most of my life story. And so Dick has been friends with my father on Facebook for a while. And so he'd read some of my work and he was familiar with my writing style. But we didn't have a chance to meet in person until one of my friend's grandfathers passed. And I attended the Shiva for him because his family's Jewish. And so it was the gathering after the formal funeral. And Dick happened to be at the Shiva. And so we had a chance to connect in person for the first time, and we had a really great conversation. And so a couple months, maybe even a year later, Dick was looking for someone younger to write for Before Ferguson, Beyond Ferguson. And so he reached out to my father, who also happens to be a former journalist, so he's familiar with the trade. And he reached out to me, and I've been writing for Before Ferguson, Beyond Ferguson ever since.
Thanks so much, Leyla. And I'm excited to hear a little bit more how you dove into this project and kind of your thinking around the story. But I also want to turn to Misha now. Misha, thank you so much for being with us today. And I'm curious how the zip code that you live in or the neighborhood has been previously portrayed in the media. How are people normally talking about 63106?
So 63106 had not been portrayed in a good light. We had some challenges in our zip code, from a variety of different things, whether it be the poverty level or the crime or just normal day-to-day issues that you find in urban areas. So being a part of this project has brought some new light to the zip code of 63106 and just letting people know there are good, hardworking people that are trying to make changes and make improvements, but we still have challenges as any other neighborhood would. during this pandemic.
Thank you, Misha. And I also just curious about what has the project or the stories that even Leyla has worked on been able to show people about your zip code or your family during the COVID-19 pandemic that you thought was just very important that you wanted to share with others?
Well, it's definitely brought awareness to the zip code itself. There have been a lot of great opportunities to bring awareness from other zip codes, including some of the churches in other areas, different organizations in other areas that have now learned about this through Leyla's amazing story that she's written. It's definitely painted a picture of the neighborhood, the good, the bad, and the not so good. So yeah, it's been a great opportunity to bring light to our area.
Thank you so much. And then, so Leyla, I do want to turn a little bit into some of the how in this project and how you approach the project. So can you tell us how you thought about structuring this piece about Misha's experience and how you went about it?
Yeah, so over the course of my interview with Misha, my very first one, I was really struck by how caring and empathetic, how much empathy she has for other people. And so that's how I wanted to lead off the story. I wanted to make it clear that that's the kind of person she is. And I thought that a great way to start the story then would be with the story of how she broke her leg trying to help someone else, that even in the worst possible situation, all she wanted to do was care for other people. So I thought that would be a really important way to focus in on the story. And from there, I built outwards, and I started with a smaller moment that in the grand scheme of things doesn't relate too much to everything, but it shows who she is fundamentally. And I just connected every other part of her life to that, and to her caringness, her love for her children, her love for her sister, her love for her parents. And yeah, that's kind of what was going through my mind when I was writing. And it also helped that, like I mentioned, my father is a former journalist. So he was really able to help me with the story and give me some good pointers on where I should go into each section.
Thank you. And I want to remind our audience today that we will have some time for Q&A. So if you have any questions for Leyla or Misha, feel free to use the Q&A icon on your screen. But Leyla, so you started telling us, you gave that kind of introductory scene that sets up the rest of the story, but then you go into some insights about basically structural inequities or problems that exist within the 63106 zip code, including related to home ownership. So what can you share with our audience about some of those themes that you wanted to capture or share?
Yeah, so if we're talking about home ownership and that sort of thing, Misha's really lucky to own her home, but that isn't the case for most people in her zip code. So while Misha's very lucky in her home ownership experience, I kind of thought it was important to discuss that not everyone is that lucky, because St. Louis has a history of redlining, which has made it harder for people of color, specifically Black people, to own homes and to build generational wealth. Yeah.
And then Misha, I also just wanted to ask you a little bit more about what the response to this project has been, both from your perspective, from your family's perspective, but also how people have responded to you as the project's kind of rolled out.
So as the project rolled out, again, as I stated before, the feedback has been amazing, bringing awareness to some of the issues that my father dealt with, having, trying to purchase his home, always been a hard worker all his life. Before he retired, one of his desires or goals was to have home ownership. So that was able to bring awareness to some of the things that we dealt with when attempting to purchase the home. A lot of people didn't know the capacity of the things that I have to do with my sister. So there's been more compassion shown towards me as far as that, like, wow, we weren't aware, but when you are able to express and tell a story and tell it in a way to where these things are happening in this area while we're all still just trying to live a normal life, as normal as possible during this pandemic. It's been a good thing that the story has been shared, because it's had a positive light. I won't say that it's had anything negative. It's only been all positive. So yeah, that's about it.
Thank you so much. And then Leyla and Misha, I'm going to ask both of you kind of versions of this question. That Leyla, what advice would you give to maybe also younger journalists who are just starting out or are interested in pursuing some of their first reporting projects? Are there any resources or things that you found particularly helpful over the course of the project?
Yeah, so for me, something that was really helpful was connecting with Misha on a personal level. So while our first conversation had a purpose, it was to write a story. We connected on a deeper level than that. I consider her a friend. I love Misha. And so I think it's really important to connect with whoever it is you're interviewing, connect with the subject that you're writing about, because whether or not it's a lifelong connection, it's still important for the moment and the writing of the story. And I'd also say not to be afraid to reach out for help in writing. I was a little, I wouldn't say egotistical, but I went to the story like, oh, I'm not going to ask my former journalist father for any help writing this. I don't need it. But I encountered some roadblocks writing it the first time. And I was like, okay, I guess I will ask my dad for help. And so it's really important to realize when you might need some more resources for a story, might need some input on whether or not sentence structure works or if the story flows in a way that makes sense. So always reach out for help and connect with whoever or whatever you're writing about.
And kind of a similar question to you, Misha. We talk to a lot of journalists who are interested in how do you establish trust as you're writing a story or talking to someone or interviewing someone, or how do you even gain access to different parts of a story? So I'm really curious about the advice you would give to journalists who are interested in profiling specific people or families, or even covering neighborhoods that they don't live in. So any advice or things you would hope that they would keep in mind?
Sure, Kayla. So it's all about a relationship. You want to establish a good relationship. And me personally, I have an excellent spirit of discernment. So if my vibe is not connecting with yours, we ain't talking. So I just want to, first of all, I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. I can't say it enough to Richard. Even when he called me the first time to tell me about the project and what he was doing, I was like, okay, and you want to talk to me, but he made me feel so comfortable to where I felt like, okay, I consider him a friend. I can talk to him and share things with him. And he established that relationship up front. And he, it was no secrets or no shady stuff, behind the scenes stuff like that you see in the movies or the tabloids and all that grocery store stuff that I don't buy, walk past. So he just made me feel so comfortable. So I just want to thank him for that. And that's part of the reason why I'm able to be here. Secondly, Leyla, she considers me as a friend. I'm much, much older than her. I consider her to be my little sister. And I'm just so proud of everything that she does, all of her accomplishments. I love hearing about all of her amazing stories. And, she's a recent high school graduate on her way to her freshman year in college. So it was also a relationship there. I didn't look at her as, okay, she's just another journalist. I looked at her, okay, this is my little sister, and I can talk to her and I can share stories with her and share experiences with her, because even though we are in two different parts of the city, maybe something that I've gone through or dealt with might be helpful to her on her journey as a up and coming college freshman. So yeah, it's all about a relationship and not trying to be sneaky with it. And they both were very upfront, honest, and very personable, and I appreciate them both.
No, that's really helpful to hear. And I hope any journalists who are also on the call and curious about that take that really seriously. And then another just question for Leyla in terms of where can we kind of see any updates on this work and then any of your future writing also?
Yeah, so Misha and I just had our second interview for the second installment of the story. And so I'm working on the second piece as we speak. So hopefully that'll be out in the public eye pretty soon. So you can expect to see that on Before Ferguson, Beyond Ferguson, our website. It'll probably be sent out to some other people as well. So you can we're definitely looking forward to that new development in Misha's life. She has a couple struggles that she's gone through more recently with COVID and everything going on in the world right now. So that's what the second installment is going to be about. But personal stuff, I don't know. My Facebook, my dad's Facebook. I heading to college pretty soon, like Misha mentioned. So I'm hoping to get involved with journalism on campus and writing some short stories and poems for fun.
Awesome. Well, I will definitely be keeping an eye out for those. And so I do want to turn to, we have at least, a few questions or a question in the Q&A. And this one I think is each of you can maybe speak to a little bit. So I'll go ahead and read it from Rocky, who says, "This is such an important project that shines a light on stories that you don't usually get covered. Do you think that this project could serve as a model for other cities? And then if so, what advice do you have for journalists interested in pursuing their own projects in other places?" So I do think each of you can maybe actually provide a kind of different perspective on what's really important or critical to make a project like this work, and any advice you'd share.
Well, I guess I'll go first. Age Before Beauty. I'd like to think it could serve as a model in a number of ways. As mainstream media is beset with lots of issues in terms of maintaining staff, we can supplement their coverage and be helpful in that way. I think it also can kind of be a model in the sense of continuing to cover a family, not just once, but to keep up with them, to see how they're doing over a particular period of time. It's that's how Netflix gets going. We want you to binge watch. Maybe you can binge read on a particular family or follow a family. But one of the challenges is attention span, and people are not always for the long read. But I like to think that there are groups of people who will attach to these kinds of stories. I mean, we're still selling books, 350-page books, 800-page books. So there's an audience for it. And I think the other part is that this is part of it, that we're not just writing stories, we're engaging with the community. And so we do forums, and we've been in front of church groups and civic groups. And the Pulitzer Center, of course, is really pioneered the idea of educating, using these stories as educational tools. And we'll be in classrooms in the fall, I'm certain of that.
I'd just like to add on to Dick a little bit, because I definitely think there's potential for this concept to be replicated in other cities, because although St. Louis is special in a lot of ways, inequities is not unique to it. These sort of problems are present in most, if not all, cities. So there's always going to be I don't want to say always, hopefully it won't always be always, but there's often disparities between two zip codes next to each other. So I think it would be very easy to replicate this sort of idea. And I think every city could benefit from talking about people in underrepresented zip codes, because the positive stories like Misha's aren't the ones we typically hear. Like she mentioned earlier, we only hear about certain zip codes when someone's died, when something tragic has happened, but it's important to talk about families and the growth within them.
And I'll finish up that question. So I am a firm believer in real stories being told, not just the fiction ones, of course, that you hear about. Fiction is always great, but real stories, real people, real issues, real situations is what I personally feel people need to hear about. And it does not always have to be sunny skies and rainbows. sometimes there are going to be some dark clouds and rainy days in some of those stories, but with that, you're able to understand what everyday people go through, not just the people in St. Louis. It could be people, I saw someone is from New York in there. It could be people from in the southern area of the country. Louisiana is always getting hit hard with something. So all of these stories, real stories being told by real people with their real issues, it's a good way to hear the voice of America or just hear the voice of the people. So I'm always for a real story.
Thank you, Misha. And to that point, Leyla, I'm curious when you were writing, and also maybe Dick can answer part of this question, if you had a way that you approach balancing the fact that, you know, you want to talk about inequities or kind of really serious problems, but you're also talking about real people and in community with them, and also featuring them in some of like conversations like this. And so any just thoughts you all had in terms of like balancing those tensions, or advice you would give to maybe other journalists who are want to write?
Yeah, I think what's important is balancing out any personal antidote with statistics too. So I talked a lot about specific things that have happened in Misha's life with her family, with the community around her, but we also supplemented that with statistics about the community she was in, about the neighborhood she was raising her family in. And so humanizing statistics is what we always aim to do. And so that's kind of how I went about balancing her very real and personal story with the community and statistics around her.
Yeah, I think that's very insightful, Leyla Fern. When I teach workshops on storytelling, and what I tell people is that a story is really a three-legged stool. You have statistics, you have experts to cite, and then you have how it works on the ground, how it happens in real life. And Leyla Fern's story about Misha covers all those bases, and that's how good stories work. But you have to come back to that relationship that Leyla Fern and Misha established is so vital to it, because how it works, how race is lived in America is intimate, and it's painful, and sometimes it's joyful. And to get all of that, you have to forge that connection with the human being that you're writing about.
Thank you all. And, you know, another question that I'm curious about is your approach to outreach in this project, and how you've either connected with people since individual stories have been published, or opportunities to kind of share the story or speak in forums like this. What are you hope to communicate and connect with people in some of that outreach work?
You know, the outreach was really interesting for in my case. I worked at the Post-Dispatch for 30 years until 2005, and then as it so happened, I had written a series of stories about year 2000 about a neighborhood in 63106, and so I had already established some connections, and believe it or not, even 20 years later, many of the same people were living there. And so when we wanted to do this project, I was able to go back to those people and talk to them about what I wanted to do or try to do. And they were so helpful to me in that respect. Now, in Misha's case, it was a little bit of I hate to say it was cyber stalking. I noticed that the Friendly Temple Church was having a ceremony to recognize high school graduates, and Misha's daughter was recognized at that service. And I had a list of the participants, and I noticed that she lived in 63106. And so I went on Facebook and I looked up the name, and then I reached out and I said I didn't want to an old guy like me reaching out to a 17-year-old young woman, probably not appropriate to do, but I was able to learn that Misha was the mom, and I reached out to Misha, and that's how we got going with this. And then, Misha kind of described how I approached her, but with a lot of respect and a lot of humility, and I like to think.
Yeah, and I was also thinking, Dick, about, so I know that in the project, you guys have connected with a lot of, whether it's religious communities and groups or other communities since the project has been published in terms of sharing the work. And I'm just curious about some of your hopes or thoughts around how you connect with other people after the work has been written. What are the opportunities to kind of engage people in the writing?
Yeah, we've been in front of a loose count of probably 1,000 people since the first of the year, sharing these stories and having Misha and other participants in our project, the writers and the people in 63106 share their thoughts. And it's a delicate matter. We've gotten enough traction now so that the word of mouth has come around, and so a church member will come to me and ask if us to do a program. But I was running around for quite some time, going to churches, cold calling, essentially saying, "Would you like to have us?" And it's very hard to break through because the churches, many shy away from getting political in some ways. Some of the churches have their people divided on the right and the left. And so, they think of Sunday or the Sabbath as a day of respite from all of that, and just to pray sort of in general for good things to happen. But then there are many faith groups that are all about social justice. And so we don't want to just preach to the choir, but I feel like we can hopefully expand the choir a bit by doing this work.
Yeah, no, I just think it's a really interesting model, and one that we don't necessarily see in every other reporting project. The use of those community groups and presentations, although the Pulitzer Center does them often, but to continue that work. I'm also curious, Leyla and Misha, what your experiences have been like engaging in those outreach opportunities and telling people about the work.
It's all been very positive for me. I think I'm able to grow, and because obviously I've had thoughts about life and these prevalent issues, but it helps a lot to speak them out loud as well, and to organize my thoughts into a way that's presentable for other people. And so I've definitely benefited from it in that sense. And I like to think, like Dick said, that we're growing a choir because in some settings we're speaking to people who already are on the same page as us, and it's really nice too when there are people who maybe don't see eye to eye with us on everything and are here to grow and learn from our experiences, from Misha's experiences, from anyone we're writing about.
For me, it's being able to bring the awareness to people that may not have known anything about it. And I think I've shared that before, but it's having the opportunity to speak and share and get the feedback and have the questions, sometimes the not so easy questions that people want to ask that they may not have asked the person before, that they just randomly see on the street. So being able to have the opportunity to share, that is one of the benefits for me.
And a kind of similar question in the Q&A now from Jack, who asks, he says, when you're reaching out and speaking to schools, how do you plan to tailor your talks to different age groups? What's the youngest age group that you think you might be able to talk to, or you might be able to include in that? So I don't know, if you have spoken to schools yet, but maybe even thinking forward, how you might approach that conversation.
Yeah, that's one thing I'm going to do. I always tell young journalists to know what you don't know. And I'm not sure that I actually know how I would approach a 5th grade class. I think I have a better idea of high school, or maybe even middle school. But I'm lucky and fortunate to have a daughter who teaches 5th grade or 4th grade at a charter school in Washington, D.C. So she'll probably give me some pretty good guidance in that respect. But I think the one thing that one true thing that you can hang your hat on here is that people resonate with story in particular ways. They're interested in reading about people who are, I guess, what you call exotic or different. And so Misha lives in a neighborhood unlike many of our readers or participants. At the same time, they also resonate with people who are just like them, who want the same things for their kids or their families. And so the really nice thing about Leyla Fern's story about Misha is that it goes back and forth between, oh, wow, she is really, Misha's really up against some challenges, unlike anything that I have. And then you get to some paragraphs that say, Misha's just like me. She's loves her kids, and she's, goes out of her way to help them. And then I thought one of the neat parts of the story were the way in which her kids do things for Misha to make her feel better and to have a good day. And so that's those are the cards that we would play in the classroom too.
Yeah, I probably have not mentioned this to Dick or Misha, but in May, I just graduated from John Burroughs School, if any of you are familiar with the St. Louis area, but I came back after my last day of classes to speak to a class of 7th graders who are reading A Raisin in the Sun with one of the 7th grade English teachers. And as a part of that, I taught them about redlining and some inequities around the St. Louis area. And I also talked about the story, which is why I was invited back. And so I have actually done a little bit of teaching with younger kids about this topic. And I think, honestly, you might be surprised by how much they already know and are willing to take in about it, because although they were initially surprised by some of the statistics I shared, it really made sense to them too. And they're like, wow, yeah, it sucks, but it makes sense that there are these inequities in our region between Clayton, like Dick mentioned, and where Misha lives near Carr Square. And so what was important for me was presenting it in a way that is digestible for a 12-year-old, but still allows them to grow and to think deeper about the topic, because I didn't want to shy away from any of the hard topics, but I also didn't want to scare them away from it too. And so it was important for me to find the balance of what was appropriate for them starting off and getting into social justice and where they could continue to grow from it.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that, just in terms of kids, it's so important for children, I think, to recognize that they're in a generation. They're part of their families span generations. They all, they have moms and dads and grandpas and grandmas and great grandpas, and to recognize that they're part of this continuum. And so what we try to do with our stories is talk about of the generations that came before, and the hopes that you have for the generations that are coming after. And what is so neat about Misha's family, she's got 3 generations right in the same household. That isn't true of many families, but in Misha's case, it's true, and it really presents a terrific opportunity for Leyla Fern to dive into this in subsequent stories.
Yeah, I'll just finish up with that. I was just going to say, I think it's important for kids to learn it as early as possible. Their experiences, they may have experienced things that they did not know was a social justice issue in kindergarten, 2nd, 3rd grade. I had an experience attending a DSEC program while in 4th grade at one of our districts here in South St. Louis County. and never knew in a million years that there was so much discrimination and so many differences, I'll say that. But it's a way to, stories like these, the way that Leyla has written it, the way that Richard has introduced it, it's a way to let kids know, and it encourages them to read, it encourages them to write, to express themselves through, they could be a classroom of many journalists. So yeah, it's important for them. I feel especially important for kids to learn this stuff early on.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more thing that I remembered from my conversation with the 7th graders at my school. And that was that part of Before Ferguson stems from the Ferguson Commission, which happened as a result of the shooting of Michael Brown in 2014. And so I talked about that with the kids a little bit, and it was strange to realize that most of them were in elementary school when it happened. And so they had no memory of it, or if they did, it was very vague and blurry. And so what was also important was setting a baseline of information needed to understand the story and to understand subsequent history. And so while I think I was in the 6th grade when Michael Brown was shot, I was old enough to remember it. And I was old enough to go to protest with my father when it happened. And so it was really important to give them background information on the shooting of Michael Brown and everything that happened before it and everything that happened after it.
Thank you all. This is really important. And I'm glad, we also covered how, students can think about this and get engaged. And I'm also thinking to you, Leyla, who was a student when you started kind of working on this project and thinking how even younger students can even be involved in the journalistic process. So maybe one additional question for you. And if there are any other questions for the Q&A, please go ahead and just throw them in the chat. But one kind of final question for you all is, like, we've talked about from the perspective of how journalists who are interested in doing similar projects can kind of learn from some of the work you've all done or could get involved. But I'm curious for your general readers, how can they be supportive to the project? How can they support or be involved in the work going forward, whether that is through community events or any other ways? Is there something that you're hoping readers will be able to engage with?
Well, we depend a lot on what people used to call word of mouth. I guess it's with social media, it's different in some ways, but I love it when people share our stories on Facebook. They do a share or they retweet or whatever it is. And what's even more useful is that they say what they like about the story. What was it that instead of just saying you ought to read this, well, what was it that made you resonate with the story? That's always useful. I think the other thing is to understand that where we come from as journalists. A lot of progressives, and I imagine this our stories have more of an audience or more sympathy with progressives, but a lot of progressives sometimes are disappointed with journalists because we don't particularly push an agenda. We certainly get into how public policy impacts on a family, but we're not there to push anybody's particular focus, and so sometimes folks get disappointed with us from that standpoint. We're different. We stand a little bit apart.
I was gonna just share with this project the 3 famous words that we always hear: like, share, subscribe, or and in this case, engage. If you see a story and you see that it's something that's so impactful to you, reach out to the writer, see how you can be of assistance, or maybe you might have your own story that is similar to that can be shared. So definitely, and in this world of technology that we live in, it's important. The importance of liking the story, sharing, subscribing, and engaging is totally important.
And just to add on to that, I think that a lot of people who have read the story or similar ones kind of happened upon it. It wasn't like they were seeking to read something on the subject, it just kind of found them. And while I think that's really important that our stories are just finding people, I think it's also important that people go out of their way to read about people in areas that aren't like theirs, or people in areas like this. I just think it's important to seek information and to seek knowledge. And specifically, I know a lot of people on the call watching right now are not from St. Louis. And so looking for stories like ours in the area that you're in and learning about the people who live in your community that you don't necessarily hear about all the time, I think it's really important to seek out information.
Awesome. Well, I'm so thankful to each of you, Misha Marshall, Leyla King, and Richard Weiss, for today's conversation. And thanks to our audience. Is there anything else that you guys just wanted to share in closing about the project or your experience?
Well, I'll share one thing that I was tremendously influenced by journalist, writer, Isabel Wilkerson, who I'm sure you guys know and many people in the audience know. And she wrote a book called The Warmth of Other Suns, and has since written another one. And she was interviewed recently, and I try to share this with the groups that I talk to about why we do what we do. And so I just wanted to read this quote. Ms. Wilkerson calls for what she says is radical empathy, to put ourselves inside the experience of others, to allow ourselves the pain, allow ourselves the heartbreak, allow ourselves the sense of hopelessness that they're experiencing. And so Wilkerson said, I view myself as being on kind of a mission to change the country, the world, one heart at a time. I feel as if the heart is the last frontier because we have tried so many other things. That's something that I carry in my head as I go about doing what I do.
Thank you, Dick. And Leyla and Misha, any other just final things you want to share with the audience today?
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Dick, for that beautiful quote, but I'd also just like to remind everyone, look out for part 2. Little promo. Misha, like I mentioned before, has gone through a lot more since our first article in the fall time. And so I think you'll really be interested in what we have to share for you.
And I just want to say just thank you for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure to share again. And thank you to Dick and to Leyla, as always. These are two of my favorite journalists. Give them whatever the top journalist award that needs to be given.
Thank you all again. I really appreciate your time here today. And I thanked our audience, but I want to thank you all for listening and submitting your questions. And also thank you to my colleagues at the Pulitzer Center, especially Holly Peipenberg, our producer for today's session. We appreciate all of you for joining us today. And for those who are able, please support the Pulitzer Center's mission with any level of contribution. Remember, we are a nonprofit journalism organization, so we depend on donors to carry on our work. I'd also like to share information about an upcoming event. It's called Health Systems in Collapse, Understanding an HIV Outbreak in Pakistan with Dr. Helen Oyang. This conversation will be on July 20th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, and you can register at pulitzercenter.org/events. And if you'll just please stay with us a few minutes longer to take a brief survey after we officially close today's session. Thank you for being with us today, and I hope you'll join us again soon. Bye for now.